Hey everyone, this is Lexy Gavin with PokerCoaching.com, and today I'm going to talk to you about pre-flop hand ranges for no-limit cash games. So let's jump right into the PowerPoint. So important factors to consider are position, opponents, stack sizes, implied odds and reverse implied odds, and the table dynamic. So having position is advantageous. Raising early will force you to play out of position most of the time. So the earlier you open, the less likely it is that you will act last post-flop. So the earlier you open, the stronger your hand should be. By having the ability to act last, you can gain more information by seeing what people are doing before you and having the ability to check back and pot control post-flop. Position really is everything, and you don't want to play weak hands out of position. Think in terms of your perceived range when opening in different positions. So when you open a hand, you're telling a story. So when you're playing post-flop, always make sure that your story makes sense. Know that when you open in middle position and you check the Jack 10-4 turn ace and delay c-bet and bet the turn, your opponent will know that you likely won't have king-queen because you didn't choose a continuation bet. So that's what I mean about making sure your stories make sense, and always think about your perceived range. Don't be tempted to play hands that have reverse implied odds. So we're going to talk about what implied odds and reverse implied odds are later in the presentation. So here are some of your raise first in ranges. Here's your button range. And I also added your under the gun range. I wanted to compare the two because these ranges have the most contrast. So as for the button, this is the best position to have. You get to act last, therefore you can open the widest range. So you're going to be opening roughly 56% of the hands on the button when it's folded to you. So the open raises are shown here in blue and the whites are fold. So as for under the gun, this is your tightest range. When you open under the gun, you are often going to be out of position, which makes it more difficult to play post-flop. We're raising most suited aces, and FYI, ace-7 and ace-6 are the worst aces to have because you can't make straights with them. So that's why we didn't include those, but we did include ace-5 and ace-4. So hands like king-queen off is on the fence, but we did include it here. It's a marginal open, so as a general rule, make your decision to open this hand based on your opponents at the table. If your table is really tough and full of good players, you're just going to want to fold this pre-flop. King-queen off can't really defend to a 3-bet in this position, so if you're at a passive table, you can play it, but looser aggressive tables, you're probably just going to want to throw this away. So under the gun +1. And under the gun +2. So for UTG +1, we added in roughly another 3%. We've included all suited aces now, added hands like ace-jack off, which is like what I was saying about the king-queen off under the gun. Only play this if your table is on the softer side. Under the gun 2, we're adding in roughly another 3%, so now we're opening 17% of hands. We're opening all pairs, more suited connectors with some high suited double gappers like king 9 suited. So middle position, we're now at roughly 19%. I added hands like queen jack off. Again, this is a bit loose, so only play it if your table allows for it. And the low jack. We're now opening around 21% of hands, adding in hands like Jack 8 suited, 10 8 suited, 6-5 suited, and up. In the hijack, here we're opening roughly 25% of hands. As you can see, we're loosening up quite a bit with hands like King 8 suited and up. I added Jack 8 suited, but not Queen 8 suited because Jack 8 suited, you have more straight possibilities. We added suited gappers like 8-6 suited and up. In the cutoff, we're now opening roughly 30% of hands, a little less. Here, your opens will start to depend on who are in the blinds. So if you have aggressive players in the blinds, you may want to fold hands like 4-3 suited or king 7 suited. If there are weaker players in the blinds, you can even widen this range up a little bit. And I don't want you guys to worry about memorizing this. These are just general guidelines. Some people have tighter ranges, some people have looser ranges. I think that mine is a little bit more on the looser side. So if you're just new to poker and just starting out, you may want to tighten this up just a bit. Small blind. So small blind strategy is one of the trickier spots in poker. Some players recommend limping a wide portion of your range. The big blind is often incentivized to raise versus limp, so we want to balance our range and add some limp calls or limp re-raises with some strong hands. So in blue, I have your raises at roughly 19%. The hands in red are your calls, not necessarily your calls folds. These could be calls, raises. Yeah, you get the point. So you should always be aware of who is in the big blind. If the big blind is a fish, you can complete the small blind more so they come along into the pot and you can outplay them post-flop. Against weaker players, you don't have to worry about balance as much, but good players will always be watching what you're doing. So if the big blind is more solid, you should try and mix it up more to keep them guessing and keep them on their toes. So mix in some limp calls, limp re-raises, limp shoves, and open raises and open shoves. If you are raising from the small blind, I recommend choosing a bet sizing of minimum 3x to 4x the big blind. You always want to go a little bit bigger blind versus blind because you don't want to give them a good price plus position. So now let's talk about opponents. Have the weaker players folded already? So it's important to know what type of players there are still left to act when opening a pot. If a hand is a marginal open, but the 3 best players are to your left, you should lean towards folding more. On the other hand, if you have a weakish hand, say in the cutoff and the blinds are fishy, you should lean towards raising. You always want to try and play pots versus weaker players, especially if you have positions, so always try and lure them into the pot. How aggressive are the players behind? Do they have a balanced 3-bet range? So if the players behind you are strong, you should always know whether or not your hand can defend versus a 3-bet and what your strategy should be. If you're under the gun and you're at an aggressive table with a lot of 3-bets, you may want to avoid opening small pocket pairs and those ace-jack off types of hands. And if you're planning on opening versus a 3-bet heavy table, definitely mix in some balanced 4-bets. I'm going to be doing a presentation within the next few months on 4-bets. Good candidates for these hands would be hands with good removal like ace-9 suited and king-queen off. So now you want to think about, again, we talked about this, but what types of players are in the blinds? So again, it's always important to look at who are in the blinds. It's more pertinent when you're opening from late position. Some players way under defend their blinds where others over defend. And by that, I just mean some players are not calling enough and some people are over calling. So first, let's talk about the big blind. Your range is going to open up a lot in the cutoff and the button if the big blind is either type of extreme. If they underdefend, you're just going to print money by them folding their blinds. And it adds up over time, you'd be surprised. Others tend to call way too wide because they hate the idea of forfeiting their big blind that they've invested already. So they're going to have way more junk than normal and way more junk than they should. And you'll be able to play position against them. So if the big blind is an unknown or defending a proper range, then you can stick to the charts as a general guideline. If you're in late position, say the cutoff or the big blind, and you're on the fence about an open, you'll want to see what type of player is in the small blind as well. Again, some people have a 3-bet or fold-only strategy from the small blind. So if you have, for example, a hand like king deuce suited on the button, and you know that the small blind has a 3-bet or fold-only strategy, king deuce could be a hand that you open because A, your king blocks a decent chunk of their 3-bet range, and B, if you do get 3-bet, it's a decent hand to 4-bet bluff because of you have removal with the king. So these are just some things to consider when you're thinking about how to play your raise versus in range versus the small blind. So more on opponents. Adjust your range based on the table dynamic. So you don't only want to think about your opponents as individuals, but how the table is playing as a whole. Ask yourself, what has the game flow been like? If it's an aggressive table, you should tighten up. If the table is super passive, then you should be opening a lot of hands. Is it a fun, loose, friendly table? Are the majority of players drinking alcohol? These can be some things to take into consideration as well. Are any of my opponents tilted? So if so, figure out a way to adjust to that. There are different types of tilt. Some players tilt by playing too many hands, never folding to 3-bets. Try and get their chips in the middle as fast as possible. Against these players, you should tighten up until you have a hand. And when you do have a hand, you should be bombing it, size-wise. If you're at a table with tilted or weak players, you want to try and isolate them or invite them into the pot so you can outplay them post-flop. Other players tilt because they feel like no matter what they do, they are always getting beat. You ever get that feeling like you just feel like you can't win a hand? Every time you have a hand, someone's got you outkicked or something like that. So these players have a tendency to overfold their hands. So you can exploit this by opening wider and c-betting more versus them. Sometimes even the best players have a bad day, and it can affect how they play the table. So picking up on this is very important because you want to have a dynamic play style that can adapt to this properly and capitalize on the opportunity. How do my opponents perceive me? Is also something you want to consider. So always be cognizant of how your opponents perceive you. If you think your opponents view you as a nit, then you can get away with widening your pre-flop opening ranges a bit. We all go through spurts of being dealt premium hands, so we're constantly opening pots. If this is the case, your opponents are probably seeing you as opening very wide, in which case you might have to tighten up a bit pre-flop. I've noticed that people will label you based on how you've been playing the last hour or so. So it doesn't matter if you've been at a table where you've been card dead for 4 hours. If that last hour you've been blasting and opening a lot and just making hands, they're probably going to be labeling you as an aggressive opener. So take that into consideration. And don't forget, your opponents will be able to see if you're tilted. So if that's the case, take a deep breath and get your game back to equilibrium. Every situation is unique because no two poker players play exactly the same. So it's your job to try and figure out what type of player you're playing against and how you can adjust your strategy to exploit them. So now let's talk about stack sizes. How do these stack sizes affect my range? And then we're going to compare deep stack to shallow stack play. So stack sizes play a big role in determining your range. In general, the smaller your stack size, the less playability you have. If you're shallow stacked, you can't afford to play a street or two post-flop and lose. And opening hands that you can't defend versus a 3-bet is an easy way to bleed chips. When you're raising off a short stack, you're putting a large percentage of your stack in the pot. So this creates a low stack to pot ratio, or SPR, what the cool kids are saying. When you have a low SPR, you are more committed to the pot. So always think in terms of SPR when there are short stacks at your table. You're gonna have to play for stacks with overs if the effective stacks are small. I did a presentation on SPR and over pairs, so that should be out by now. So go back and watch that if you want to learn more about how to calculate your SPR. So say you're opening a friendly position and the players behind you have effective stacks of 10 big blinds and under. You can't really raise fold in this type of situation because you'll be getting too good of a price to call if you get shoved on. So you want to adjust your range in these spots. If you can't call a 3-bet shove, you should probably just fold pre-flop or adjust your strategy to where you're open shoving a balanced range. There are many push-fold game theory optimal charts you should study for these types of situations. And when you're deeper stacked, you have the luxury to play a wider range because you have greater implied odds. The deeper stacked you are, the more playability you have, so you can get away with more while being able to create a higher stack to pot ratio. When you're deeper, you can size up your bets a bit because it's unlikely that, say, with 200 big blinds effective, that you're going to get your opponent's entire stack in a non-3 bet pot. So sizing up helps create smaller stack to pot ratios. This is also why you can play more hands in a 3-bet pot when you're deeper stacked. If your opponent has like pocket aces and you have pocket fives on the deuce 5 board, they're going to have a hard time folding their pocket aces, even for 200 big blinds if you play it fast. So now we're going to talk about the differences with cash and tournaments. So in tournaments, chip preservation is super important because tournaments are more about survival. So the number of big blinds you have determines if you can afford to open or not. So as the tournament progresses and more people are being knocked out, your chip EV increases, so your chips are worth more money than when you first started the tournament. So your opening ranges are going to be quite different in tournaments than in cash games. You need to fight for pots more in tournaments because there's already so much dead money in the middle with the blinds and antes. You can't just wait for aces every hand. So you're going to be opening a wider range once the blinds and antes have kicked in. Pre-ante ranges are going to be very similar to cash game opening raises because in the early stages of the tournament, you're often 100 big blinds or more effective. So in the early stages of a tournament, or if you're playing a cash game, a hand like King 9 suited could be a fold under the gun, whereas in a tournament with 40 bigs with antes in play, you can consider opening. So now let's talk about implied odds. Implied odds, how much you expect to win after you complete your draw. So this means that you have an opportunity to make money off your opponent if you make some kind of nut combination. So let's look at an example. So you raise under the gun to 3x the big blind with pocket sevens with a 200 big blind effective stack. The player to your left 3-bets to 10x the big blind. Your opponent is representing a strong hand like a high pocket pair or a strong suited Broadway. If stacks are 100 big blinds or less effective, this would be an easy fold. But since stacks are 200 big blinds effective, your implied odds to stack your opponent are high if you flop a set. So when the board runs out 8, deuce 7, and you have pocket sevens, they're going to have a hard time folding their pocket aces or kings. So when you're deep, you can make these types of pre-flop calls. Now let's talk about reverse implied odds. So this refers to how much you can expect to lose after you make your hand. So when you complete your draw, you still lose frequently because your opponent has a better hand. So one example would be a weak ace high. If you hit a pair of aces with a very weak kicker, the times your opponent has you outkicked are going to be costly. Low suited cards, if you hit a low flush when your opponent has a higher flush, it will be hard not to pay them off. Example 3, King Jack off and King 10 off. These are hands with reverse implied odds. If your opponent opens an early position and the board is king high, they'll also often have you outkicked. So you basically want to try and avoid opening reverse implied odds hands from early position because their flatting ranges will generally be strong on average when you open early. And while your Jack 10 suited looks pretty nice under the gun, you're going to run into way too many awkward spots with overpairs on the board, as well as running into kicker problems when you do hit your pair. So to sum up, always factor in position when thinking about a hand. Consider your opponents. Consider stack sizes. Think about the table dynamic. And every hand of poker starts pre-flop, and it's important to understand basic raise first in ranges and fundamentals. So every spot in poker is essentially an ongoing puzzle with unique situations presented, and it's really up to you to properly adapt. Having guidelines is a helpful starting place, but a lot of your poker intuition comes over time with practice, study, and volume. So I thought we would do a quiz together. So I'm just gonna list a whole bunch of multiple choice questions with their answers, and I'm going to give you a moment to think about it, and then you can choose your answer, and then I'll explain to you why that is the best answer. So question number 1. What is the most important factor when deciding to play a pot? Position, stack size, players left to act, table dynamic, or all of the above? So I'll give you guys a minute to think about this. So the answer is E, all of the above. You have to consider all of these options as we discussed in this presentation. And I know that it could be overwhelming to think about so many different things when you're playing a hand, and it can seem overwhelming, but over time, these things are going to just become second nature, and your decisions are going to happen really quickly and easily, and they'll start to come more natural with practice. So question number 2, why is our UTG range the tightest? A, there are many players left to act. B, you don't want to play out of position with marginal hands. C, you only have position on the blinds. D, you have the least amount of information. E, all of the above. Or F, none of the above. So the answer is E, all of the above. Your UTG ranges are just the tightest. Like I said over and over, you just want to play really, really tight out of position and an early position. There are many players left to act behind you. You can get 3-bet off your hand. So in general, just try and play your tightest range in early position. So question 3. Players to my left have been re-raising me very often. How do I adjust? A, keep opening the same range and make them keep doing it. Sorry, this was a very poorly written sentence. I'm going to have to change that. Sorry. So B, fold marginal hands I'd normally open. C, min raise instead of a standard 3x big blind raise. D, raise to more than 3x the big blind. So the answer is B, fold marginal hands I'd normally open. So yeah, unfortunately, when you're at an aggressive table, you just really need to tighten up a little bit more. You could sometimes start sizing up a little bit more. So answer D would be okay only if someone opened and it folded to you in lead position, because you can't really adjust your sizing when only 1 or 2 players at the table is being super aggressive versus you, but the rest of the players are playing kind of standard. So you don't want to like start 5xing it pre-flop every hand just because 1 or 2 players are picking on you. So if this is the case, just tighten up a little bit, and against these aggressive players that have been re-raising you, throw in some 4-bets to let them know that they need to stop messing with you. So next question. My table has shown everyone is playing extremely loose today. I have ace-jack off under the gun. What should I do? Should you fold, call, raise 3x the big blind for value, or min raise 2x the big blind? So take a minute. So the answer is C, raise to 3x the big blind for value. Now, I know this is a little confusing because I've said to you in the past, if you're at a very aggressive table, you should tighten up a bit, but loose doesn't necessarily mean aggressive. There can be a lot of tables where people are playing loose, but not a loose range pre-flop, but not necessarily aggressive style. So not as many 3-bets or whatever. So in this type of situation, when they're playing a lot of junky hands, you can start opening wider for a wider value for range. A wider range for value. So next question, which hand is the best example of maximizing your implied odds? Is it A, ace-3 suited, ace-10 off, 9-6 suited, king-queen off? So go ahead and think about it. This is maximizing your implied odds, not your reverse implied odds. So the best answer for this is A, ace-3 suited. This is because if someone has a hand like ace-king and there's an ace on the board, but you flop a flush draw or a straight draw with it, with your pair, and you wind up getting there, especially when the board runs out low, like ace, deuce 4, and then you turn a 5, you're probably gonna be able to get more value than if you had a hand like ace jack and the river runs out of jack. So this is just a good hand to where your hand is going to be more disguised, and when they hit their top pair with a good kicker, they're going to have a hard time folding. So let's move on to the next question. You're in a tournament with only 13 big blinds and it folds to you on the button. You have ace-4 suited. What should you do? Min raise, fold, call, or go all in? So go ahead and think about it. So the answer I chose for this is D, go all in. So this is just a spot where I wouldn't recommend min raising. You're not, I mean, you can in some situations if the blinds are not really gonna 3-bet you, or you don't think that they're gonna shove on you, and you could maybe min raise for value, but I think you just kind of want to maximize your fold equity by going all in. And with 13 bigs effective, they could call you with a lot worse. They could call you with king jack suited and hands like that, so you could be dominating them. And shoving oftentimes looks weaker than raising. You definitely don't want to fold this hand, and calling is, I think, the worst option. So let's take a look at the next question. What is the best way to adjust your raise first in ranges to a very tight table? Keep my ranges the same. Tighten my range since they're only playing strong hands themselves. Widen my range to take advantage of how tight they're playing. Or call their raises more and try to make hands so they pay you off. So take a second. So the answer I chose for this is C, widen my range to take advantage of how tight they are playing. You don't want to tighten their ranges just because they're opening only strong hands. That would be silly. At a tight table, you're just going to win so much money by even just taking down the blinds over and over. And another way to you can open a lot of hands and get calls, and if they show any kind of aggression post-flop, you can easily fold and move on. So you're just going to print money by opening a lot of hands at a very tight table. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. What are the best reasons for folding a hand like ace-deuce suited under the gun? Is it A, we will be out of position too often, B, reverse implied odds implications if they flat us with a bigger ace, C, this hand is too weak to play out of position, D, all of the above, or E, none of the above? So the answer that I chose is D, all of the above. So you don't want a hand like ace-deuce suited to be a standard open under the gun, especially in cash games. For all of these reasons, you'll be out of position, reverse implied odds, implications, etc. So if you're playing a tournament and you're at a tight table and the blinds and antes are high, there's argument for opening hands like any suited ace under the gun. But as your typical under the gun range with 100 big blinds and more, I would just fold this because it's just a little bit too weak. So let's go ahead and jump to the next question. So when you have a low SPR, you are A, more committed to the pot, B, less committed to the pot, or C, none of the above. So go ahead and take a moment. And the answer I gave is A, you are more committed to the pot. So again, the lower the SPR, the better odds you're getting and the more committed you are to going with the hand. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. What is the best way to manipulate SPR? Is it A, by raising bigger pre-flop, B, by 3-betting and check raising more, C, flatting more hands, D, is it A and B, is it B and C, or is it A and C? So go ahead and take a moment. So the answer that I chose is D, A and B. So by raising bigger pre-flop and by 3-betting and check raising more. So basically, when you're putting more money in the pot and building bigger pots, it lowers the SPR. So flatting more hands doesn't really make much sense. So why are raise first in ranges different in tournaments than in cash games? Is it because A, tournaments are about survival? B, your chip EV increases as the tournament progresses? Not has. C, you have to fight for blinds and antes? D, you aren't as deep stacked? E, all of the above? Or F, none of the above? So the correct answer is E, all of the above. So again, all of these, first of all, tournaments are about survival, and your chip EV increases as the tournament progresses. You need to work more to take down those blinds and antes because they're just going to eat away at your stack, and you aren't as deep stacked, so your ranges are definitely going to change when you're playing a tournament. Your ranges will also change in ICM situations. So, for example, when you're nearing the money, or if you're at a final table bubble, or at the final table and the pay jumps are significant. So even then, your ranges are going to change. But we'll do another presentation on that at a later date. And finally, the last question. What are implied odds? Are they A, how much you expect to win after you complete your draw? B, your chip EV? C, how many big blinds you have? Or D, how much you expect to lose after you make your hand? So the correct answer is A, how much you expect to win after you complete your draw. So that wraps up today's presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed it and learned something. Remember, when thinking about your raise first in ranges, just always think about your opponent's position, the table dynamic, your stack sizes, and make a calculated decision. Like I said, it is, if you're just starting out, it's going to take you some time to nail down these ranges, but after a while, you'll start getting it. And nothing is set in stone. Like I said, if your table is good, you can adjust these ranges. If it's tight, just figure out what is the best strategy and go from there. So thanks for watching. As always, you can ask me any questions on Instagram or Twitter, and I'm happy to answer them. All right, see you guys on the next one. Thanks.